Two mobile police cruisers sat parked on the thick, damp grass of my front lawn. Their roof lights washed rhythmic waves of red and blue across the white columns of my 1920s craftsman porch. I stood on the top step, wearing a wrinkled linen blazer, holding a heavy folded document out toward a supervising sergeant. A few feet away, my father Gary, a man who had spent his entire adult life cultivating a flawless reputation among the local Baptist church congregations, was standing in his plaid pajamas, shouting that I was insane. He pointed a shaking finger at my face and demanded the police arrest me for trespassing in his mother's home. The neighbors had already stepped out onto their verandas, drawn by the noise in the humid night air. The sergeant looked down at the heavy bond paper in his hand. He traced the raised notary seal with his thumb and then looked back at my father with eyes like flat iron. "She is the owner, sir," the sergeant said. "You have 30 days to vacate." Freeze that moment right there. My name is Luna Thompson. I am 34 years old, and I work as an estate appraiser and liquidator. That is me standing on my own front lawn being called a liar in front of the man who raised me. To understand how I ended up needing an armed police supervisor to prove I hold the deed to the very house I was standing in, we have to rewind exactly 3 days. Before I show you how a single leather ledger and a deep understanding of public records unraveled a federal crime, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Welcome back to Ariana Revenger, where the quiet ones always keep the receipts. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been pushed out of your own space just to keep the peace for a toxic family. Because what my father and his girlfriend were standing on did not belong to a single person in that house except me. This is the story of how patience, a keen eye for documentation, and one single deed dismantled a felony. 3 days before those police cruisers arrived, I was driving back into Mobile after a grueling 3-week business trip. I had been traveling back and forth across the Gulf Coast, evaluating estate properties, cataloging antiques, and settling accounts for grieving families. I was bone-tired. The Alabama heat was pressing down on my car like a wet blanket, and all I wanted was a long shower and the quiet sanctuary of my own bed. I pulled my car into the familiar gravel driveway of the historic craftsman home I had loved since childhood. I grabbed my overnight bag and walked up the brick path expecting the usual comforting silence. Instead, I found my belongings treated like yard waste. 6 black plastic garbage bags sat slumped on the porch boards baking in the afternoon sun. The plastic was stretched tight over the sharp corners of wooden hangers and shoeboxes. Through a tear in the side of one bag, I could see the collar of my favorite winter coat and several of my expensive silk work blouses spilling out onto the dusty wood. Someone had literally bagged up my life and thrown it outside. I stood perfectly still on the steps, letting the reality of the scene sink into my skin. I did not drop my bag. I did not run to the door, pounding my fists against the wood. My profession requires a clinical detachment when assessing the remnants of a life, and I applied that same detachment to my own front porch. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house instantly felt foreign. My grandmother had kept this place smelling of lemon oil and old paper. Now the heavy, stagnant air in the foyer reeked of cheap drugstore cologne and lingering grease from fried food. Random coats were thrown over the antique banister. A pair of unfamiliar boots sat carelessly tossed onto a handmade Persian rug that I had personally restored. The silence I craved was replaced by the chaotic noise of a television blaring from the back of the house. I walked slowly down the hallway, taking inventory of every changed detail. My eyes caught a subtle difference near the study. The heavy brass lock on the hall closet where we kept sensitive household maintenance files had been swapped out for a cheap modern deadbolt. The installation was sloppy, leaving fresh scratches on the historic wood. Just below it, a side table drawer sat slightly open, showing papers that had clearly been shuffled and disturbed. I filed that specific detail away in my mind immediately. I continued down the hall and stopped dead in the doorway of the master bedroom. A teenager I had never seen before in my life was sprawled across my mattress. He was shouting into a gaming headset with a controller gripped tight in his hands, ignoring my presence entirely. His muddy sneakers were resting directly on my late grandmother's fragile hand-stitched quilt. That quilt was a piece of textile history pieced together during the Depression and carefully preserved for decades. Seeing mud ground into those delicate seams triggered a visceral reaction in my chest. It offended me both as a granddaughter and as an appraiser who knows exactly how hard it is to remove stains from vintage cotton. This boy was Tyler. He was 19 years old and the son of my father's newest girlfriend, Brenda. He had taken over the primary bedroom as if he had signed a lease, tossing my carefully curated life onto the porch to make room for his game consoles and snack wrappers. Before I could even process the disrespect inflicted on the heirloom fabric, Brenda walked out of the kitchen. She was carrying a glass pitcher of sweet tea with ice clinking against the sides. She moved through the hallway acting like she owned the very floorboards beneath her feet, entirely unbothered by my sudden appearance in the corridor. She paused to take a slow sip from her glass, looking me up and down with a gaze that assessed my worth and apparently found it lacking. "Oh, good you are back to get the rest of your things," she said. Her voice carried that syrupy southern cadence that masks pure condescension. "Tyler really needs the space, and we figured you would not mind since you are always out of town anyway." She smiled a smile that was all teeth and zero warmth. She stood there waiting for me to break down, waiting for a screaming match that she could use to paint me as the hysterical daughter who could not handle her father moving on. I looked at Brenda, and then I looked past her to the teenager wiping his dirty shoes on a piece of my family history. I looked at the new lock on the closet door and the rifled paperwork in the drawer. I felt the familiar weight of my leather appraisal ledger tucked securely under my arm. That ledger was my constant companion, a detailed record of every valuable item and document tracing back to my grandmother. I did not yell at Brenda. I did not confront Tyler and demand he get off my bed. I did not throw her sweet tea against the pristine walls or break down in tears. A frightened person argues, but a dangerous person observes. I simply took out my phone, snapped a clear, high-resolution photograph of my clothes baking in the garbage bags on the porch, and quietly turned around. They thought they were kicking a submissive pushover out of a spare room to build their new comfortable life. They had no idea the historical ground they were standing on belonged to only one person in that entire county, and it was certainly not them. The screen door rattled behind me as I turned away from the teenager and the heirloom quilt. My father Gary stepped out from the kitchen, wiping a smear of barbecue sauce from his chin with a paper napkin. He wore his favorite golf shirt and the practiced expression he always deployed when he needed to manage a difficult situation. It was the same reasonable patriarch face he saved for the church deacons or the bank tellers when he needed a loan extension. He walked into the hallway carrying himself like a man who held the deed to the ground he walked on. He looked at me standing near the defiled bedding and then glanced at Brenda. He did not ask how my business trip had gone. He did not apologize for the garbage bags cooking on the front porch. Instead, he let out a long, suffering sigh and held his hands up in a gesture of forced patience. "Now, Luna, do not make a fuss," he said. His tone was coated in that thick, patronizing warmth meant to make me feel like a difficult child. "You are always traveling for work anyway. Brenda and I are building a life here, and Tyler needs a real room. You can take the sunporch when you are in town." The sunporch. He actually offered me the sunporch. It was a poorly ventilated glass enclosure tacked onto the back of the historic house in the 1970s. It had no insulation and no central air conditioning. During an Alabama summer, the temperature inside that glass box easily reached 95 degrees by mid-morning. He was offering me a sweltering greenhouse while a 19-year-old stranger slept in a primary bedroom that had belonged to my family for nearly a century. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to drop my overnight bag and strip the delusion away from him right then and there. I wanted to march him out to the front steps and force him to read the brass numbers on the mailbox that legally belonged to me. But then a memory surfaced, cutting through the humid heat of the moment. I felt my late grandmother Ruth steady my racing pulse. I remembered the afternoon she sat me down in her parlor smelling of lavender and old paper and pressed a thick envelope into my hands. She taught me that true power never needs to shout. True power sits quietly and waits for the precise moment to reveal itself. If I yelled now, I would just be playing the role Brenda had scripted for me. I would be the hysterical daughter, the antagonist to their happy new blended family. A frightened person argues, but a dangerous person agrees. So I did something that surprised even me. I let the tension drain out of my shoulders. I allowed my eyes to look weary and defeated, matching the exact picture of a pushover they had painted in their minds. I looked at the floorboards and let out a soft, defeated breath. "You are right, Dad," I said, keeping my voice hollow and tired. "I am exhausted from the drive. Let me just grab a bag and figure it out." The transformation in the hallway was instantaneous. The rigid defensive posture melted right off my father. Relief flooded his face, washing away the church mask and leaving behind the smug satisfaction of a man who had successfully bullied his way into getting exactly what he wanted. Behind his shoulder, Brenda actually smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was the victorious smirk of a woman who had tested the boundaries of her new territory and discovered there were no fences. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully dominated the space and evicted the nuisance daughter without a single legal hurdle. That was fine. Let them feel victorious. Let them drop their guard. I reached down and picked up my overnight case. Then I reached over to the hall console table and picked up my worn leather appraisal ledger. That book goes everywhere with me. It is thick-bound in dark calfskin and filled with detailed notes, serial numbers, provenance records, and historical valuations of every estate I have ever handled, including this one. Brenda glanced at it dismissively, seeing nothing but a boring notebook. She did not know that the information contained within those pages would soon matter more than any object she could ever hope to purchase. I turned my back on the two of them and walked out the front door, stepping past the black garbage bags without giving them a second glance. I walked down the brick path to my car and climbed into the driver's seat. The heat trapped inside the vehicle was stifling, but I did not turn the key right away. I sat in the silent cabin and looked back at the house through the front bay window. The curtains were drawn back, letting the afternoon light spill into the parlor. I could see Gary and Brenda standing near the fireplace. My father had his arm wrapped around her waist and he was laughing. His head was thrown back comfortable and complacent, spending his evening like a man who had just pulled off a brilliant maneuver and gotten away clean. That specific comfort was exactly what I needed from him. As an estate liquidator, my entire career revolves around unearthing the truth hidden beneath layers of family mythology. People lie about what things are worth. Families lie about who inherited what piece of silver or which parcel of land. But paper never lies. A proper chain of title does not care about your feelings or your new girlfriend or how confidently you speak in a hallway. I knew something Gary had apparently forgotten or perhaps had willfully chosen to ignore. This house was never his to give away. It was not a shared family asset waiting for him to claim it. The foundation they were standing on the roof over their heads, the very walls they were currently redecorating, belonged to me and me alone. I put the car in gear and drove away from my own property. I was not retreating to the sweltering heat of a sunporch. I was retreating to find a quiet place to think, because my professional instincts were blaring a silent alarm. The changed deadbolt on the hall closet and the rifled paperwork in the side table drawer kept flashing through my mind. Gary was lazy. He did not change locks or dig through files just to make room for a teenager. He was looking for something. He was securing something. Kicking me out was not just about making space for Brenda and Tyler. It was a symptom of a much deeper rot spreading through the house. They needed me gone because I was a witness to whatever scheme they were running. The decoy was officially set. My father believed I was driving off to lick my wounds and accept my new status as a guest in my own life. He felt safe, but he had fundamentally misunderstood the daughter his mother had raised. I drove toward the downtown business district, finding a generic hotel where I could set up a temporary base of operations. I needed a secure internet connection and a clear head. I was going to pull the public property records and trace exactly what my father had been doing while I was traveling the Gulf Coast. I was going to audit my own life. I parked in the hotel garage and carried my overnight bag and the leather ledger up to a room on the 4th floor. The space was sterile and quiet, a perfect environment for the work I needed to do. I dropped my bag on the bed, sat down at the small laminate desk, and opened my laptop. I intended to log into the county portal and print a simple copy of my deed just to have the physical proof ready for whatever conversation came next. I had no idea that the digital public ledger was about to reveal a betrayal so deep it would change the course of all our lives. Before digging into the digital receipts and uncovering the true depth of the betrayal, I need you to understand the woman who raised me. Every action I took from this moment forward was rooted in a solemn promise I made to her. My grandmother Ruth was a formidable presence. She was forged from Depression-era steel and wrapped in expensive French perfume. She possessed an uncanny ability to read people, and she viewed financial stability as the ultimate measure of a person's character. She taught me everything I know about appraising value. She showed me how to look at an antique and see the history, the hidden flaws, and the true worth beneath the polished surface. She applied that exact same scrutiny to the people in her life. Ruth had spent decades observing my father. She watched Gary finance a lifestyle he could never genuinely support. He operated on the delusion that looking wealthy was the same thing as building wealth. He mortgaged 2 different vehicles and a recreational boat on a middle management salary, always chasing the illusion of success. My grandmother bailed him out of a foreclosure when I was a child, and she swore she would never write a check to cover his vanity again. She understood his fatal flaw perfectly. He loved spending money he had not earned, and he possessed an endless capacity to justify his mounting debts. He believed the world owed him comfort. In the spring of 2019, her health began to fail, but her mind remained as sharp as a newly honed blade. She knew exactly what would happen when she was gone. One humid April afternoon, she called me into her bedroom. The space smelled of dried lavender and medicinal rubbing alcohol. She sat propped up against a mountain of white lace pillows. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that demanded absolute attention. She reached under her heavy quilt and pulled out a thick manila envelope. She placed a folded warranty deed directly into my palms and closed my fingers tight over the heavy paper. "I am deeding the property to you, Luna," she said. Her voice was brittle but completely unwavering. She explained that she had drafted a document reserving a life estate for herself, ensuring she could remain in the home until her passing, but legally transferring the remainder interest exclusively to me. "I am not leaving this legacy to your father," she told me. "If I handed him this deed, he would have the property burdened with loans and lost to the bank inside a single calendar year." She squeezed my hands with a surprising amount of strength. Then she delivered a command that has lived under my skin ever since. "Do not tell Gary about this transfer," she instructed. "Let him assume whatever he wants to assume about the will. And Luna, do not ever let that man make you feel small in your own house." I looked into her tired eyes, and I promised her I would protect the estate. I promised I would stand my ground. She passed away 3 weeks later, leaving a void in my life that no antique or appraisal could ever possibly fill. Yet for the next 5 years, I broke that deathbed promise a little fraction every single day. I allowed Gary to remain in the historic craftsman home without paying a dime in rent. When the property tax bills arrived from Mobile County, I paid them quietly from my own business accounts. When the roof needed repairs after a severe coastal storm, I hired the contractors and settled the invoices while my father was out playing golf. I stayed perfectly quiet during Sunday dinners when he would spread his arms wide and welcome guests into what he loudly called his mother's house. I never corrected him in front of the neighbors. I never corrected him in private. I let him play the role of the generous patriarch, hosting barbecues and holiday gatherings on land he did not legally possess. I convinced myself that my silence was an act of profound love. I believed that keeping the peace was the mature adult choice. That was the central lie I used to navigate my complicated family dynamic. I told myself that if I never made a sound, if I never asserted my legal authority, my remaining family would stay intact. I treated my ownership of the property like a shameful secret instead of a hard-earned responsibility. I compartmentalized my existence. In my professional life, I was a ruthless appraiser, negotiating top dollar for clients and spotting fraudulent claims from a mile away. But the moment I walked through the front door of my own home, I shrank. I became the accommodating daughter willing to sleep on a sunporch just to avoid a difficult conversation. Sitting in that sterile hotel room staring at the blank screen of my laptop, I finally understood the true cost of my avoidance. The original warranty deed was resting securely inside a steel-safe deposit box at my downtown bank. I knew it was physically protected from any fire or theft, but a document only holds power if the owner is willing to enforce it.
My silence had not kept anyone whole. It had not fostered gratitude or respect or family unity. It had only taught Gary that I was a sponge willing to absorb any level of mistreatment. By hiding my authority, I had trained him to view me as an inconvenience rather than the rightful landlord. I had spent 5 entire years making myself diminish into the corners of the very home my grandmother gave me, specifically so I would never have to experience that exact feeling. I realized that peace built on the suppression of the truth is just a delayed war. Gary thought my compliance was permanent. He assumed that because I had never fought back, I simply did not know how to fight. I placed my hands on the cool metal of the laptop keyboard. The room was quiet save for the low hum of the air conditioning unit. I was not just preparing to check a public property record. I was preparing to resurrect a promise I had been failing to uphold for half a decade. I dreaded the impending collision. I knew that breaking my long-held silence might entirely sever the last fragile threads connecting me to my father. Exposing his delusion would be painful and messy, but the alternative was letting a stranger like Brenda dictate my existence and allowing a 19-year-old kid to wipe mud onto a piece of my grandmother's history. I opened the web browser and navigated toward the county tax portal. My heart beat with a steady, deliberate rhythm. The decoy phase was officially over. I took a deep breath, letting go of the compliant daughter persona I had worn for far too long. It was time to let the estate liquidator take the wheel. I typed in my home address, ready to retrieve the digital proof of my ownership. I expected a mundane administrative task. I expected to find my name clearly listed as the sole proprietor, just as it had been since 2019. I had no idea that the screen loading in front of me was about to reveal a betrayal so deep it would demand a police presence and threaten to send my father to a federal penitentiary. I sat at the narrow laminate desk in my hotel room, listening to the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning unit. The space felt completely isolated from the humid Alabama evening outside the window. I opened my laptop and navigated to the Mobile County Probate and Property Records portal. My intention was straightforward. I planned to download a certified copy of the warranty deed my grandmother had executed in 2019. I wanted a crisp physical printout to hand to the police supervisor tomorrow morning to swiftly end my father's delusion. I typed in my property address on Elm Street and clicked the search button. I expected a single primary entry confirming my sole ownership alongside the routine tax payment histories. I took a sip of lukewarm water while the database retrieved the file. The page refreshed, and the breath entirely left my lungs. The screen did not show a clean, unbroken chain of title resting safely in my name. The digital ledger displayed a brand new entry filed a mere 35 days ago. My eyes tracked across the grid to read the document type. It was recorded as a quitclaim deed. I clicked the hyperlink to open the scanned image of the filing and watched a nightmare render itself in high-resolution black and white. The document formally purported to transfer all my right title and interest in the historic craftsman home directly to Gary Thompson. It stated that I relinquished my ownership for the sum of $10 and other valuable consideration. I stared at the glowing monitor, unable to blink. I scrolled down to the bottom of the second page where the grantor's signature block was located. My name was written there in blue ink, but the hand that wrote it was not mine. As an estate appraiser, I spend countless hours verifying the authenticity of historical documents, artist signatures, and provenance letters. I know how to read the pressure of a pen stroke and the habitual slant of cursive script. I zoomed in on the image. The loop on the capital letter L in Luna was entirely wrong. It was top-heavy and hesitant, lacking the fluid muscle memory of a signature I have executed thousands of times. The cross on the letter T was dragged too far to the right. Someone had spent time practicing my handwriting, but they failed to capture the natural rhythm of my hand. Next to this clumsy forgery sat a crisp, circular notary stamp, complete with a signature and a commission expiration date. My father had not just pretended to own the house to his new girlfriend. He had manufactured a binding legal document and filed it into the permanent government record. I closed the deed viewer and returned to the main property index, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The quitclaim was only the first step. Right beneath that fraudulent transfer sat another fresh recording. It was a deed of trust, securing a home equity line of credit.
The lender was a local credit union headquartered right here in Mobile. The principal amount listed on the public record was exactly $50,000. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with sickening precision. This was the detail I had missed while I was traveling the Gulf Coast, appraising other people's estates. My father had not executed a spontaneous crime of opportunity. This was a clean, deliberate, calculated chain of events. You forge a deed to make yourself the legal owner. You record that deed at the county courthouse to legitimize the theft. Then you take that recorded document to a mid-tier bank and borrow heavily against the collateral you just stole. The disjointed clues from my brief visit to the house suddenly made perfect sense. I remembered the cheap new deadbolt hastily installed on the hall closet door. I remembered the side table drawer sitting slightly open with the household maintenance files visibly disturbed. Gary had needed my old tax receipts, insurance policies, and perhaps previous closing documents to gather the necessary parcel identification numbers and legal descriptions for the quitclaim form. He needed access to my filing system to pull off the fraud. He locked the closet afterward to hide his tracks until he could finalize the loan. 30 days ago, roughly the exact time this loan would have funded Gary, abruptly started wearing expensive new leather boots. He began paying out of pocket for Brenda to receive premium salon treatments. The extravagant backyard barbecue with the catered food and the overflowing coolers was not funded by his modest pension. He was funding his patriarchal cosplay using the stolen equity from my grandmother's legacy. He had not merely given my childhood bedroom to a disrespectful teenager. He had methodically manufactured a paper trail that on its face legally positioned him as the rightful owner and relegated me to the status of a delusional trespasser in my own home. And here is the specific realization that made my hands go completely cold resting on the keyboard. Because that forged deed was now officially recorded and stamped by the county clerk, the public record no longer showed a clean, unencumbered title in my name. It showed a severe legal dispute. My authentic warranty deed from 5 years ago and his fabricated quitclaim deed from last month now sat stacked on top of the exact same property parcel. To the untrained eye of a patrol officer responding to a trespassing call or a bank teller looking at a screen, his document was the newer one. His document appeared to supersede mine. I was no longer holding a simple case that a beat cop could resolve on a front porch. I was holding a complex legal battle. Gary thought he had successfully outsmarted his doormat daughter. He assumed I would look at the official-looking paperwork, feel overwhelmed by the bureaucracy, and quietly retreat to the sunporch or a rented apartment. He banked on my lifelong habit of avoiding conflict to shield him from the consequences. What he had actually done was cross a line that could not be uncrossed. By executing this scheme, he had committed forgery, perjury, uttering a forged instrument, and federal wire fraud by securing a bank loan under false pretenses. These were serious felony offenses that carry mandatory prison sentences. But these were felonies I would now have to conclusively prove. I would have to fight against a binding legal document that bore my own name. The burden of proof had suddenly shifted onto my shoulders. If I went to the police right now, they would look at the county portal, see 2 conflicting deeds, and declare it a civil matter. They would tell me to hire a lawyer and sort it out in mediation, while Gary continued to drain the equity from my family home. He had weaponized the legal system against me. I sat back in the generic hotel chair and stared at the digital proof of my father's treason. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a luxury for people who have someone else to fix their problems. When an estate appraiser is wronged, she does not weep. She authenticates. She catalogs the discrepancies. She builds an airtight portfolio of evidence. My father believed that paper was power. He thought that because he managed to get a fake document past a bored county clerk, he had won the war. But paper is only as strong as the truth backing it up. I knew better than any defense attorney alive exactly how to prove a signature is a lie. I knew how to track a notary commission. I knew how to establish an irrefutable timeline. The decoy phase of my return was over. Gary had enjoyed his expensive barbecue and his moment of triumph. Tomorrow morning, the real work would begin. I closed the laptop and picked up my leather ledger. I was going to pay a visit to the local credit union that funded this fraudulent loan. and I was going to introduce them to the actual owner of the collateral they just mistakenly accepted. The morning sun was already baking the asphalt when I pulled into the parking lot of the local credit union. The building was a modest brick structure wedged between a sprawling shopping plaza and an older residential neighborhood. It was the kind of regional financial institution that prided itself on personal relationships and community ties. It was exactly the sort of place where a charming man like Gary could walk in, leverage his local church connections, and push through a questionable transaction without facing the rigorous scrutiny of a major national bank. I gathered my leather appraisal ledger, my driver's license, and the heavy watermarked original copy of my 2019 warranty deed. I walked through the sliding glass doors, prepared to rectify what I assumed would be a swift administrative correction. I expected to present my undeniable proof watch, the bankers pale in horror at their oversight, and immediately freeze the fraudulent accounts. I was directed to a glass-walled office near the back. The loan officer sitting behind the desk was a man in his late 40s wearing a neatly pressed short-sleeved shirt and a tie that matched the corporate colors. He introduced himself as Marcus and offered me a seat with practiced professional courtesy. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed my original warranty deed flat on the surface of his desk next to his branded coffee mug, and I explained the situation using clear, unambiguous terminology. I informed him that the $50,000 home equity line of credit issued 35 days ago against the property on Elm Street was secured by a fraudulent document. I told him the quitclaim deed transferring ownership to Gary Thompson was a forgery. I waited for Marcus to blanch. I waited for him to reach for his phone to call the fraud department, or perhaps the branch manager. He did not do any of those things. He looked at my original deed, then pulled up the account file on his dual monitors. His posture shifted from welcoming to carefully guarded. He interlaced his fingers and rested them on his desk, looking at me with a mixture of polite patience and firm resistance. He began, his tone measured and defensive. We possess a fully executed recorded quitclaim deed that clearly transfers the title to Mr. Thompson. The document is properly formatted, and it bears a notarized signature. We also have all the corresponding loan agreements signed in person. He paused to let the weight of the bureaucracy settle over the conversation. From our perspective, this appears to be a personal family disagreement regarding the disposition of an asset, not an instance of institutional fraud. If you wish to contest the validity of the recorded transfer, you will need to pursue that matter through the civil court system. He then reached into a drawer and actually slid a glossy trifold brochure across the desk toward me. It outlined the credit union's external dispute resolution process. That specific gesture, pushing a generic pamphlet at me while holding the keys to my stolen equity, was the precise moment the reality of the situation crystallized in my mind. I was not going to win this battle simply by possessing the truth. Being right was only the very first step in a brutal, exhausting 15-step process. The financial system is designed to protect its own transactions, and they view any recorded county document as absolute gospel until a judge explicitly orders them to do otherwise. They had given Gary $50,000 based on a piece of paper, and they were not going to unravel their own loan portfolio based solely on the unsworn verbal complaint of a frustrated daughter. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw the brochure back at him or threaten to call the local news stations. I kept my vocal register low and perfectly steady, matching his bureaucratic tone with clinical precision. The signature on that quitclaim deed is a forgery, Marcus, I stated clearly. I can demonstrate the mechanical discrepancies in the penmanship, and I can prove my physical whereabouts on the date the document was supposedly executed. He sighed, giving me the exhausted, weary look of a man who deals with angry ex-spouses and warring siblings on a weekly basis. "That is a matter for a court of law to decide, Ms. Thompson," he replied. "As a financial institution, we must rely on the instruments recorded by the county clerk. Until a judge invalidates that deed, our loan remains active and secured." I realized then that arguing with him was a pointless expenditure of energy. He was a gatekeeper programmed to deflect liability. So I immediately changed my tactics. I stopped trying to convince him and started building my evidentiary portfolio. I shifted from victim to investigator. "I understand your position," I said, picking up my original deed and sliding it back into my ledger. "In order to proceed with my civil filings, I formally request a certified copy of the recorded quitclaim deed from your file, the complete loan origination package, and the name and commission number of the notary public who stamped the transfer document." Marcus hesitated, visibly uncomfortable with the sudden pivot. He clicked his mouse a few times, reviewing company policy on his screen. He wrote down the county recording instrument number on a sticky note and handed it to me. "I can provide you with the recording index number so you can pull the public deed yourself," he said. However, the internal loan origination file and the specific identity of the closing agent are proprietary records tied to Mr. Thompson's account. I cannot release those to a third party without a court-issued subpoena. I took the sticky note and stood up. "That is perfectly fine, Marcus," I replied, keeping my composure absolute. "I will secure the subpoena. Please ensure a litigation hold is placed on all physical and digital records associated with this file. Have a productive day." I walked out of the credit union feeling the heavy, humid air hit my face. I had not frozen the funds, but I had obtained the one piece of information I needed to pry the entire scheme apart: the county recording number. I drove straight to the probate court building downtown. For $3, I purchased a certified printed copy of the fraudulent quitclaim deed from the clerk's office. I took the document back to my car, sat in the stifling heat of the parking lot, and examined it closely. There at the bottom of the second page, next to the clumsy forgery of my name, was the notary seal. I took out my phone and photographed the stamped impression, focusing specifically on the name and the numeric commission identifier printed inside the circular border. I drove back to my hotel room and immediately opened my laptop. The state of Alabama maintains a searchable public database of all commissioned notaries through the Secretary of State's office. As an appraiser, I use this database frequently to verify the provenance of historical bills of sale or old estate transfers. I typed the name and the commission number from Gary's forged deed into the search fields and hit enter. The system queried the state records for several seconds before returning a single matching profile. I stared at the results on the screen and I felt a cold, sharp thrill radiate through my chest. There it was, the fatal structural crack in Gary's perfectly constructed chain of fraud. The database confirmed the identity of the notary, but the status line was glaring in bright red text. The commission number stamped forcefully next to my supposedly authentic signature had officially expired 8 full months before the date printed on the quitclaim deed. An expired notary stamp renders any notarization legally void. Whoever executed that document had either stolen an old physical stamp or outright fabricated the seal using graphic design software, hoping no one would ever bother to check the expiration dates in the fine print. Either way, the result was identical. The foundational document supporting my father's $50,000 theft was structurally unsound. An estate appraiser lives and breathes by the authenticity of documents, and Gary had just unknowingly handed me a piece of paper that legally cannibalized itself. I finally had a loose thread hanging from the hem of his elaborate deception. Now I just had to carefully, deliberately pull it before he ever noticed his entire plan was unraveling. I possessed the digital proof of the expired notary commission, but I knew that exposing a fraudulent deed in a civil courtroom would take time. The legal system moves at a glacial pace, even when the evidence of forgery is overwhelming. During that bureaucratic delay, my father and his new makeshift family would retain physical control over the property and everything inside it. I needed my business records, and more urgently, I needed the physical proof of the estate itself to prevent them from liquidating the assets before the title could be officially cleared. I drove back to the house on Elm Street precisely at noon the following day. The Alabama midday sun was brutal, casting harsh, sharp shadows across the wide green lawn. As I parked my car on the street, I could hear the loud, melodic chatter of a backyard gathering. Brenda was hosting a luncheon for her social circle to cement her new status as the hostess of a historic home. The thick, humid air carried the distinct tang of smoked meat and traditional white barbecue sauce. I walked up the concrete driveway and glanced through the large pane-glass window of the den. There was Tyler, the 19-year-old intruder lounging on the sofa in the middle of the day.
He was playing a video game and using a 1920s solid mahogany side table as a footrest. That specific table featured hand-carved ball and claw feet and original brass hardware. It was worth more than the vehicle parked in his mother's name. My chest tightened, but I kept my breathing slow and measured. I bypassed the front entrance and walked directly through the side gate, entering the backyard patio area. A dozen women in bright sundresses were seated around wrought iron tables. They were eating chicken salad and sipping iced tea from delicate floral teacups. My trained appraiser eye instantly recognized the porcelain. Brenda had dug into the dining room hutch and was serving her casual backyard barbecue on my late grandmother's vintage Haviland china. A single dropped plate on those stone pavers would permanently destroy a collection that had survived the Great Depression. I did not stop to scold her. I walked straight past the bewildered guests, stepping onto the patio stones with deliberate, focused purpose. Brenda spotted me from across the yard. Her faux Southern hostess smile vanished instantly, replaced by a tight mask of indignation. "Excuse me, what are you doing here?" she shrieked, her voice cutting sharply through the polite conversation. I did not turn my head. I did not acknowledge her presence or validate her outrage. I walked through the sliding glass doors right into the kitchen and made my way down the hall toward the formal parlor. The parlor was dark and cool, preserved exactly as Ruth had left it. I went straight to the locked glass front cabinet tucked in the corner of the room. I used the small brass key I always kept on my personal key ring and opened the heavy wooden door. I reached past the tarnished silver platters and retrieved the item I had truly come to collect. It was a thick, leather-bound estate portfolio. Before she passed away, my grandmother and I had spent an entire winter meticulously documenting her legacy. We cataloged every single antique, every piece of jewelry, and every architectural fixture in the home. The ledger contained high-resolution photographs, precise measurements, detailed provenance histories, and certified insurance appraisals for every individual item. It was a literal fortress of documentation. If my father believed he could steal an entire estate using one clumsily forged piece of paper recorded at the county clerk office, I was going to answer his forgery with 200 pages of undeniable authenticated truth. I tucked the heavy leather book securely under my arm, feeling the familiar weight of the binding against my side, and turned to leave the parlor. As I stepped back into the central hallway, Gary purposefully blocked my path. He had rushed inside from the patio, leaving his guests murmuring behind him. He stood in the narrow corridor with his chest puffed out, attempting to physically intimidate me with his size. He was holding a pair of stainless steel grilling tongs in his right hand, gripping them tightly like a royal scepter to project his authority over the domain. The church ladies were peering through the glass doors, watching the family drama unfold with eager curiosity. "You do not just barge into my house," Gary warned, his voice a low theatrical rumble meant specifically for the audience lingering outside. I stopped a few feet away from him, ensuring I maintained a calm, respectful distance. I did not shrink back, and I did not raise my voice to match his bluster. "Your house," I repeated softly. I let those two simple words hang in the stagnant hallway air. I watched his face closely, analyzing his reaction. For one brief second, the confident facade cracked. A flicker of genuine uncertainty passed through his eyes. He glanced nervously at the thick leather ledger tucked under my arm, then back up to my face. He did not know what I had discovered at the credit union the day before. He did not know I had tracked down the expired notary commission in the state database. Because I had not screamed or threatened immediate legal action, the decoy illusion still held firm. He firmly believed I was just a defeated, sullen daughter, coming back to collect a few forgotten belongings and sulk in resentment. I maintained steady eye contact, letting the quiet tension stretch until he visibly shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Enjoy the chicken, Gary," I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and polite. "It is going to be a very expensive meal." I stepped neatly around him before he could formulate a response and walked straight down the corridor toward the heavy oak front door. As I stepped onto the wide covered porch and pulled the door shut behind me, I glanced upward. Tucked discreetly into the shadows of the porch ceiling corner were two small, high-definition security cameras.
I had arranged for a trusted local security technician to install them at 7 o'clock that very morning, long before Brenda and her guests had even woken up to prepare for their party. The lenses were angled perfectly to capture the front entry, the side driveway, and the entire length of the front lawn. I had justified the technical expense to myself by anticipating that Brenda or Tyler might attempt to steal or pawn valuable items once the formal eviction process began. I wanted a clear, continuous digital record of everything and everyone crossing that threshold uploaded directly to a secure cloud server. I had no idea, as I walked down the brick path to my car, that those unobtrusive little lenses would soon capture something far worse than petty theft and far more useful for the criminal referral I was currently building in my hotel room. My attorney Davis operates out of a traditional wood-paneled office on the second floor of a historic building in downtown Mobile. The air conditioning in his suite is always set to a freezing temperature, providing a sharp sensory contrast to the suffocating coastal heat radiating off the pavement outside. Davis is a man in his early 60s with a mind as sharp as a tailored suit. He has practiced real estate and estate law in the Deep South for over 3 decades. During that time, he has encountered every conceivable variation of familial greed, entitlement, and betrayal. He is fundamentally unshockable. I chose him specifically because he does not offer false comfort or sugarcoat terrible situations. He deals exclusively in leverage liability and documented facts. I took a seat in the heavy leather chair opposite his mahogany desk and methodically laid out the physical evidence I had gathered. I placed my original 2019 warranty deed on the polished wood, smoothing the edges with my fingertips. Next to it, I set the certified printout of the fraudulent quitclaim deed I had pulled from the county probate portal. I followed that with the $50,000 credit union lien documentation and finally the printed screenshot from the Secretary of State database proving the notary commission had expired 8 months prior to the forged signature. I did not offer any emotional commentary or dramatic embellishments. I simply presented the paper trail like a prosecutor presenting a grand jury indictment. Davis picked up the documents one by one. He read through them in total silence. The only sound in the room was the ticking of a brass grandfather clock measuring the seconds as my family mythology crumbled into legal liability. He scrutinized the looping letters of the forged signature and cross-referenced the dates on the notary seal with the state database printout. After several long, meticulous minutes, he placed the stack of papers back onto his desk and slowly removed his reading glasses. His expression was incredibly grim. He looked at me with a level of seriousness that made the temperature in the room feel even colder. "Luna," he said, his voice low and gravelly, "this is not a simple property dispute. This is federal-grade criminal activity. We are looking at a forged recorded instrument and loan fraud executed across state wires. When your father submitted these documents to a financial institution to extract $50,000, he crossed a threshold that the government takes very seriously. If we take this file and hand it directly to the United States Attorney, your father is going to federal prison. We are talking about a sentence of likely several years, not mere months." He let the severity of that statement linger in the quiet office before he introduced the complication that would split the entire narrative wide open. "But you should know your options," he continued. "We can also handle this quietly. We can file a civil action to force a judge to declare the fraudulent deed void and compel your father to make the lender whole by paying back every stolen dollar. We can legally evict him from the premises and never place a single telephone call to the district attorney." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, closing the physical distance between us. "However, the quiet route is significantly slower and inherently riskier. If we file a civil suit, he might secure his own legal counsel and fight you. He could dig his heels in and refuse to vacate." I sat still, absorbing the weight of a burden I had not allowed myself to feel until this exact moment. I was vibrating with a profound and justified fury. This man had brazenly forged my name to steal my inheritance. He had placed a hostile teenager in my childhood bed and allowed a woman I barely knew to serve sweet tea using my grandmother's antique china. He had publicly labeled me a liar on my own front lawn. Yet underneath that searing anger, a much older and far more complicated truth remained entrenched in my heart. This was still the same man who had patiently taught me how to drive a manual transmission truck along the Mobile Bay Causeway on a rainy Sunday afternoon. He was the man who had stood beside me and openly wept at Ruth's funeral, grasping my shoulder as they lowered her casket into the damp Alabama earth. The idea of taking the definitive action that would send my own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary was a line I suddenly discovered I did not truly want to cross. I resented the fact that I still harbored loyalty towards someone who had shown me zero allegiance in return. I looked across the mahogany desk, meeting my lawyer's steady gaze. "What does mercy cost me?" I asked. My voice was stripped of all emotion, sounding more like a business negotiation than a family crisis. "Control." Davis answered immediately without a second of hesitation. "The criminal route involving the district attorney is clean and certain. The government acts as the hammer, and the burden of prosecution is lifted entirely from your shoulders. The quiet civil route means he could counter-sue to drag the proceedings out. He could demand discovery request continuances and intentionally drain your financial resources. He might even win a temporary delay if that fraudulent notary cannot be swiftly tracked down and deposed. Choosing mercy is the expensive option in this scenario, Luna. It is not the easy path." His blunt assessment reframed my entire perspective on the unfolding disaster. I realized I was not simply choosing between a desire for revenge and a moment of weakness. I was defining my own moral foundation. I was choosing whether I wanted to become the kind of person who ruthlessly discards family members the very instant it becomes legally convenient to do so. That cold, calculated detachment was the exact strategy Gary had employed against me. He had deemed me disposable for $50,000. If I dispatched him to a federal cell without offering a single opportunity for restitution, I would be operating directly from his playbook. I refused to let his betrayal fundamentally alter my character. I decided I would reclaim my property and establish an impenetrable boundary, but I would not adopt his lack of humanity. I picked up my leather appraisal ledger and tucked it firmly under my arm, preparing to leave. "Draft the civil complaint," I instructed Davis. "Prepare a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises for Gary, Brenda, and Tyler. And draft the criminal referral for the United States Attorney. I want both options meticulously prepared and ready for deployment. He gets to make a choice. He can return the stolen funds and vacate my house peacefully, or he can choose to fight me and face the federal consequences. But I will keep both weapons fully loaded until the keys are back in my hand." Davis nodded, a rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. He admired the strategy. The legal clock officially started ticking the moment I walked out of that wood-paneled office and stepped back into the blinding coastal sunlight. The plan was logically sound, but as I unlocked my car door, a sharp, insidious pang of doubt began to creep into my mind. I had set the terms of engagement, but I was dealing with a man who had already proven he believed the rules did not apply to him. Exactly 3 days after I discovered the trash bags baking on my porch, I pulled my car onto Elm Street, accompanied by a licensed commercial locksmith. I had spent the morning monitoring the property from down the block, waiting for the driveway to empty. Shortly before 10 o'clock, Gary, Brenda, and Tyler piled into my father's truck and drove away. They were likely heading to the sprawling retail centers across town to spend whatever was left of the $50,000 they had fraudulently extracted from my home equity. The moment their vehicle turned the corner and disappeared from sight, I gave the locksmith the signal. We moved swiftly and efficiently. The professional technician, a quiet man who asked zero questions, rekeyed the heavy front entryway, the side utility entrance, and the rear patio doors in under 45 minutes. Every compromised entry point was secured with high-grade deadbolts, and I slipped the only 2 copies of the new master keys into my pocket. While the locksmith finished securing the back perimeter, I walked onto the wide front porch to complete the next crucial phase of my preparation. I pulled out my smartphone and launched a security application, checking the live feeds from the 2 discrete surveillance cameras my technician had installed near the ceiling corners days earlier.
The lenses provided a crystal-clear panoramic view, capturing the brick walkway, the driveway approach, and the entire length of the front lawn. The video streams were actively recording and uploading directly to an encrypted cloud server, out of reach of anyone who might try to physically tamper with the hardware. But monitoring the exterior was not sufficient for what I knew was coming next. I unlocked the front door, stepped into the central hallway, and moved straight toward the formal parlor. I carried a third compact security camera hidden inside a decorative wooden bookend. I placed the bookend on a high bookshelf, angling the concealed lens directly toward the locked glass front cabinet tucked in the corner. That cabinet held my late grandmother's most valuable possessions, including an 1880s antique sterling silver service set. My extensive career appraising complicated estates after sudden deaths or bitter divorces has taught me one universal truth about human nature during a forced relocation. The most significant theft always occurs during the chaotic final days of a move-out, and the target is almost always the family silver. When people realize a ship is sinking, they instinctively grab whatever they can carry that holds immediate pawn value. Brenda struck me as exactly the type of person who would try to secure a parting gift before the eviction deadline expired. The trap was now fully armed, recording every motion inside the parlor in high definition. I stepped back outside, locking the new deadbolt behind me. I poured myself a tall glass of sweet tea from a thermos I had brought along and took a seat in one of the vintage wicker chairs positioned near the porch railing. I rested my heavy leather appraisal ledger on my lap, adjusting my linen blazer against the oppressive Alabama heat. And then I waited. I did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later, Gary's familiar truck rumbled down the street and turned sharply into the driveway, tires crunching loudly against the gravel. Brenda was the first to exit the vehicle. She marched up the brick steps carrying several large, glossy shopping bags from a high-end department store. She moved with the confident swagger of a woman who believed she had permanently secured her position as the matriarch of the estate. She did not even acknowledge my presence on the porch. She simply walked past me, shifted her shopping bags to one hip, and shoved her house key into the front door lock. The brass cylinder refused to yield. The key slid in, but it would not turn. She jiggled the metal forcefully, causing the door frame to rattle. She pulled the key out, inspected the grooves, and jammed it back in, shoving her weight against the heavy wood. When the door remained stubbornly shut, she finally turned around. The confident swagger evaporated, replaced by a sharp, glaring mask of irritation. "What did you do to the lock?" she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. I did not answer her question. I did not match her aggressive energy or validate her hostility with an explanation. Instead, I slowly stood up from the wicker chair, placing my glass of sweet tea gently on the side table. I picked up a thick manila folder resting on top of my ledger and walked over to the top of the stairs. Gary was just reaching the porch, wiping sweat from his forehead, confused by his girlfriend's sudden outburst. I held the folder out, extending it directly toward his chest. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it from my hand. "This is a formal 30-day notice to quit the premises," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level and professional. Included inside that folder is a drafted civil complaint prepared by my attorney to void a fraudulent quitclaim deed currently recorded with the county clerk. You have exactly 30 days to remove yourselves and your belongings from my property. If you are not gone by the deadline, the second envelope tucked inside that folder, the one containing a criminal referral for wire fraud and forgery, will be delivered directly to the United States Attorney. Gary stared at the legal documents through the clear plastic window of the folder. He processed the words for a moment, and then his reaction was visceral and immediate. He threw his head back and laughed. It was an ugly, loud, booming sound meant to project dominance and dismiss my authority entirely. "You cannot evict me from my own mother's house, Luna," he scoffed, waving the folder in the air as if it were a meaningless piece of scrap paper. "You have lost your mind if you think some generic legal threat is going to scare me out of my own home." Brenda did not share his misplaced amusement. She recognized a genuine threat when she heard one. She immediately dropped her shopping bags onto the porch floorboards and pulled her smartphone out of her purse, her thumbs flying aggressively across the screen. "I am calling the police right now," she announced, her voice shaking with righteous indignation.
You are trespassing on our property and trying to lock us out. We will see how tough you are when the cops drag you away in handcuffs." I took a slow, deliberate step back toward my wicker chair. I picked up my glass of sweet tea, watching the condensation drip down the sides. "Please do, Brenda," I replied, maintaining absolute composure. "And while you have dispatch on the line, make sure you ask them to send a supervising sergeant." I was not bluffing about wanting law enforcement to arrive. I desired an official police presence. I needed sworn officers to generate an incident report documenting that Gary and Brenda had been formally served with the eviction notice on this specific date. I wanted official witnesses to the boundary I had just drawn in the sand. But as I brought the glass to my lips, I realized my hands were not quite steady. The surface of the tea trembled slightly, reflecting the intense internal conflict warring beneath my calm exterior. Nobody else on that porch could see the emotional toll this confrontation was extracting from me. Only I knew why my hands were shaking. Somewhere deep beneath the practiced clinical detachment of an estate appraiser, a 5-year-old promise made to a dying grandmother, and a lifetime of complicated love for a father who had just called me a thief, were violently grinding against each other. It takes a massive psychological effort to stand your ground against the person who taught you how to ride a bicycle and read a map. The decoy phase of my return was definitively over. The quiet compliance they had counted on was dead. The active confrontation had begun, and the lines of battle were clearly drawn. We were locked in a standoff, and the silent high-definition cameras I had just finished arming were about to earn their keep in a spectacular way I could not yet foresee. 2 mobile police cruisers pulled up to the curb within 10 minutes of Brenda ending her frantic call to dispatch. The heavy doors slammed shut, and 3 officers stepped out onto the humid asphalt, adjusting their utility belts. The arrival of law enforcement was the exact audience my father and his girlfriend had requested, but it was also the precise documentation I needed. As the officers approached the brick walkway, Brenda immediately launched into a theatrical performance. She adopted the exaggerated persona of a distressed Southern belle, clutching the actual string of imitation pearls around her neck. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest, her voice quavering with manufactured panic. "Officer, you have to help us!" she cried out, leaning toward the youngest patrolman. "This woman is trespassing on our property and trying to illegally lock us out of our own home. She changed the locks while we were out running errands." The young patrolman, a man who looked like he had barely graduated from the academy, held his hand up to calm the situation. He asked for identification and requested to see any paperwork proving ownership of the residence. I remained seated in my wicker chair, projecting an aura of complete professional detachment. I unhurriedly opened my leather appraisal ledger and extracted the heavy watermarked original copy of my 2019 warranty deed. I handed it to the officer, explaining calmly that my late grandmother had legally transferred the property to me prior to her passing, and that I was the sole lawful proprietor enforcing a formal eviction. The young officer scanned the warranty deed, nodding slowly, as he read my name printed clearly on the grantee line. It appeared to be a straightforward open and shut case of a belligerent tenant resisting a legal lockout. But then, Gary stepped forward, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He reached into the manila folder he had carried out from the house and produced a freshly printed certified copy of the quitclaim deed, the very document he had fraudulently recorded at the county courthouse 35 days prior. He handed his paperwork to the patrolman with a confident flourish. "That deed she just gave you is outdated," Officer Gary declared loudly, ensuring the neighbors watching from their adjacent porches could hear his defense. "I have a newly recorded quitclaim right here proving she legally transferred the property back to me last month. She is angry because we had a personal disagreement, and now she is trying to retaliate by attempting an illegal eviction." The young officer took Gary's document and placed it side by side with my original warranty deed. He compared the parcel identification numbers and the recording stamps. I watched his brow furrow in confusion. The situation had suddenly shifted from a simple trespassing complaint to a complex bureaucratic knot. He handed both documents back to us and shook his head. "Ma'am," he said, turning to address me directly, his tone carrying a note of official dismissal. "There are 2 conflicting recorded deeds presented here today. The county clerk has stamped both of them.
That makes this a civil title dispute. As law enforcement, we do not have the jurisdiction to determine which document holds legal precedence on the scene. I cannot just take your word over his when he possesses a recently filed instrument. If you want them removed, you will have to take this matter up before a judge in a civil courtroom. For the first time since I returned to Mobile, the solid ground of being undeniably right nearly collapsed beneath my feet. My stomach plummeted, hitting the floorboards of the porch. This was the exact trap I had recognized and feared when I first audited the digital property records in my hotel room. The legal system is designed to default to inaction when presented with competing paperwork. On the surface of a preliminary police investigation, his deliberate fraud and my absolute truth looked legally equal. If the police refused to enforce my ownership claim, Gary would be allowed to remain in the house potentially for months, while a civil lawsuit crawled its way through a backlogged court docket. He would continue living rent-free, draining the stolen equity, while I paid the legal fees to unspool his lies. He had effectively weaponized the county recording process to paralyze the police. I felt the familiar urge to retreat to apologize for the confusion and quietly pack my ledger away. But the memory of my grandmother's firm grip on my hands anchored me to the present moment. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with the patrolman or accuse Gary of being a liar. When an appraiser encounters a forged provenance document, she does not debate its validity using emotion. She dismantles the forgery using verifiable data. I opened my leather ledger to a specific tabbed section and retrieved 3 distinct pieces of paper. I stood up and laid them out in a neat row across the wide wooden railing of the porch, directly in the officer's line of sight. First, I placed my original 2019 warranty deed. Next to it, I set down the printed screenshot I had pulled from the Alabama Secretary of State database, clearly highlighting the Notary Public Commission details. Finally, I placed a photocopy of my current United States passport open to the pages displaying 3 distinct entry and exit stamps from customs officials in Europe. I looked the young officer in the eye and then turned my attention to the supervising sergeant who had been silently observing the exchange from the bottom step. His deed is a forgery, I stated, my voice cutting through the humid air with absolute clarity. The notary public who allegedly witnessed my signature on that quitclaim document had an expired commission. The state database record right there proves her authority lapsed 8 full months before the date printed on my father's filing. Furthermore, I was on another continent when that document was supposedly executed. My passport stamps confirm my location. I did not sign that transfer. I pointed a finger toward Gary, ensuring the sergeant followed my gesture. This is not a civil dispute over misfiled paperwork. This is a felony forgery in progress designed to facilitate a fraudulent $50,000 bank loan. I am the sole owner, and I have legally served them formal notice to vacate. The supervising sergeant stepped up onto the porch and leaned over the railing. He possessed the tired, skeptical demeanor of a veteran officer who had mediated countless ugly domestic disputes. He picked up the Secretary of State printout and scrutinized the expiration date printed in red ink. Then he compared it to the notary seal stamped onto Gary's quitclaim deed. He read the dates twice. I watched a subtle but unmistakable shift occur in his posture. The bureaucratic dismissal evaporated, replaced by the sharp, focused attention of an investigator who has just spotted a glaring discrepancy. The sergeant turned slowly to face my father. "Sir," he said, his voice devoid of any previous warmth, "can you explain the date discrepancy on this notary seal?" Gary opened his mouth to deploy his usual charismatic defense, but nothing came out. The smug, triumphant smirk he had worn moments earlier completely vanished. He looked at the paperwork on the railing, then at the sergeant, and finally at me. He stammered, searching for a plausible excuse, but the lie was too complicated to invent on the spot. He had counted on the police taking the recorded document at face value. He never anticipated that I would arrive armed with the state notary database and international travel records to instantly dismantle his forgery on the front porch. The sergeant watched my father flounder for a few agonizing seconds before making his determination. "This is a civil eviction on its face," the sergeant announced, addressing Gary with authoritative finality. "We cannot physically remove anyone today without a court order from a judge. However, I am officially noting a possible criminal fraud in the incident report based on the evidence presented regarding the notary seal.
If what this woman is alleging holds true, you are treading in extremely dangerous legal territory." He pointed to the manila folder I had handed Gary earlier. "You have been formally served, sir. You have 30 days to figure out your living situation." It was not a total and immediate victory. The sergeant had made it perfectly clear that the courts, not the police department, would ultimately settle the title dispute and authorize a physical removal. Gary and Brenda would still have access to the house for the duration of the notice period. But the sheer humiliation plastered across Gary's face, right in front of the watchful eyes of the neighborhood, was palpable and profound. His grand illusion had been shattered in public. The church ladies watching from their verandas had witnessed the police questioning him about fraud. He had tried to use the authorities to intimidate me, and instead I had used them to document his crime. I had successfully survived the terrifying moment when a piece of fraudulent paper nearly defeated the truth. The battle was far from over, but I had firmly established the perimeter, and the 30-day countdown clock was now officially ticking loudly in my father's ears. You do not publicly corner a narcissistic man like Gary without provoking a massive retaliatory tantrum. When his carefully constructed facade cracked on the front porch, he did not retreat to reconsider his actions. He immediately shifted his strategy, deploying the only weapon he truly understood how to wield effectively. He mobilized his social network to control the narrative. By the time I woke up in my sterile hotel room the following morning, the local Baptist church prayer chain and the extended family group text messages had already convicted me. Gary and Brenda had spent the entire evening spinning a masterful piece of fiction, casting me as the ultimate antagonist in their fabricated family tragedy. According to the story circulating through mobile, I was a greedy jet-setting daughter who had been corrupted by the lucrative world of high-end estate appraisals. I had supposedly returned home from a glamorous overseas trip completely unannounced, determined to throw my grieving, vulnerable father and his sweet, newly formed family directly onto the street without an ounce of provocation. The narrative was designed to exploit every Southern convention of familial duty and elder respect. My phone screen was cluttered with notifications. I had 16 new text messages and 4 missed calls, all from relatives who had not spoken to me in years. The most aggressive communication came from my Aunt Sarah. Sarah is my father's older sister, a woman who views her role in the family as the ultimate moral arbiter. She left a blistering 3-minute voicemail that vibrated with self-righteous indignation. She called me a heartless monster. She accused me of desecrating my grandmother's memory, stating that Ruth would be absolutely broken-hearted to see me behaving with such profound cruelty toward my own flesh and blood. Listening to her voice echo in the quiet hotel room, I felt a familiar, sickening weight settle in my chest. In the past, my immediate reflexive response to this kind of organized familial hostility would have been complete withdrawal. Silence had always been my primary defense mechanism, my old, reliable armor. I felt the gravitational pull of that old habit tugging at me fiercely right then. The urge to stay quiet, to absorb the accusations, to keep the fragile peace, and to avoid making another sound was almost overwhelming. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flashing notification light on my phone, and I very nearly gave in to the pressure. I considered drafting a lengthy apologetic text message, trying to explain the intricacies of the forged notary seal, hoping they would simply understand my side of the story. But as the voicemail played a second time, a specific detail buried deep within Sarah's angry tirade caught my attention and instantly turned my blood to ice. The social smear campaign itself was upsetting, but it was ultimately just noise. The real danger lay in the legal maneuver Gary was simultaneously executing behind the scenes. Amidst her screaming, Sarah casually mentioned that Gary had already hired a lawyer. That was alarming enough given the timeline, but her next sentence was the one that truly terrified me. She claimed that Gary's new attorney was quietly assuring the family that they had secured an affidavit and a reliable witness who could swear under oath that I had signed the quitclaim deed completely willingly. According to this new fabricated story, I had sat down at the kitchen table and signed the property over to help my father pay for mounting medical bills. A witness. The word echoed in my mind, drowning out the rest of the voicemail. The entire foundation of my strategy rested on the objective impossibility of the document. I possessed the expired notary commission record and my passport stamps proving I was traveling internationally on the listed date. But the legal system is notoriously messy when contradictory human testimony is introduced. If Gary managed to manufacture a credible individual willing to commit perjury and swear they physically saw me sign that deed, my neat, clean documentary evidence could instantly be muddied into a convoluted, he said, she said scenario. If a civil judge was presented with a recorded deed, a sworn witness affidavit, and a father claiming medical hardship against a daughter brandishing passport stamps, the court would almost certainly refuse to grant a summary judgment. A judge would likely order the validity of the deed to be determined at a full trial. A trial could be scheduled many months, perhaps even a year away, depending on the court docket. During that entire prolonged period, Gary would remain comfortably entrenched in my house, legally protected from eviction, while the credit union lien quietly accrued interest against my equity. The delay tactic alone could financially devastate me. This was the critical juncture where remaining silent would have cost me absolutely everything I had promised to protect. So I made a conscious, deliberate decision to break the habit my grandmother had warned me against. I did not pick up the phone and scream back at my aunt or my father. Engaging in a chaotic, emotional shouting match was exactly what they expected and desired. But I definitively stopped hiding. I realized that ignoring the smear campaign was no longer an option, because the gossip was now forming the basis of a fraudulent legal defense. I needed to meticulously document their attempts to subvert the truth. I began archiving every single text message, saving the audio files of the voicemails to a secure cloud folder, and taking detailed notes on the specific language they were using to spread their narrative. More importantly, I quietly began tracing the potential identity of this alleged witness. I reviewed the names of the guests Brenda had invited to her backyard luncheon. I considered Tyler and his teenage friends. I thought about the men Gary played golf with on Sunday afternoons. Anyone closely associated with my father was a potential candidate for subornation of perjury. They believed they were successfully building a coalition of sympathetic family members to pressure me into submission. They did not realize that by broadcasting their fabricated alibi through Aunt Sarah, they had inadvertently handed me their legal playbook. I was using their gossip to build a comprehensive record of their conspiracy. Still, as I sat alone in that hotel room watching the sun set over the mobile skyline, I felt a profound sense of genuine fear for the very first time since this ordeal began. The clinical detachment of the estate appraiser was failing to keep the anxiety at bay. Having the truth on my side was no longer sufficient. Gary had recognized the vulnerability in my documentary evidence, and he had just introduced a chaotic human element that made it entirely possible for his elaborate lie to win. He was escalating the conflict from a simple forgery to a coordinated legal assault, and I knew I had to adapt my strategy immediately if I wanted to retain any hope of reclaiming my grandmother's legacy. The battle lines were shifting, and the next encounter would determine who controlled the narrative in a court of law. The 30-day eviction clock was ticking down relentlessly. With exactly 20 days remaining until the deadline, my attorney Davis forwarded me an email that perfectly encapsulated my father's arrogance. Gary had retained a lawyer who operated out of a generic strip mall situated between a discount furniture outlet and a dry cleaner. This attorney promptly fired off a cease and desist letter demanding I immediately retract my notice to vacate. The letter included a formal settlement offer that bordered on the absurd. If I agreed to drop all civil and criminal complaints and legally sign the property over to Gary, he would graciously agree not to pursue counterclaims against me for the severe emotional distress I had allegedly caused his family. The sheer audacity of the proposal was staggering. He was offering to forgive me for discovering his felony, provided I surrendered my entire inheritance to him. Davis advised me to ignore the letter completely and proceed with filing the civil complaint. However, I needed to understand exactly what kind of fabricated evidence Gary was preparing to submit to a judge. I needed to see his hand before the cards were played in a courtroom. Against my attorney's initial advice, I agreed to a face-to-face meeting.
We chose a neutral location, a brightly lit chain diner situated right off the interstate halfway between my hotel and the house on Elm Street. I arrived 10 minutes early and slid into a vinyl booth that smelled faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. Gary, Brenda, and their strip mall lawyer arrived together, moving as a united, confident front. Gary slid into the booth across from me, wearing a smug, self-satisfied expression that made my jaw clench. Brenda sat pressed closely beside him, her trademark smirk firmly in place, projecting the image of a supportive partner standing by her falsely accused man. The lawyer, a nervous-looking man with a cheap suit and a briefcase that looked overstuffed, squeezed in on the outside edge. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and retrieved a thick manila envelope, placing it deliberately in the center of the sticky Formica table. My client wishes to resolve this family misunderstanding without involving the courts. The lawyer began, his tone attempting to convey a seasoned authority he clearly lacked. However, if you continue to press these baseless fraud allegations, we are fully prepared to defend the validity of the property transfer. We have secured compelling documentation that completely contradicts your narrative. He placed his hand flat on the envelope and slowly slid it across the table toward me. I opened the flap and pulled out the contents. The first page I saw caused my heart to slam violently against my ribs. It was a sworn, notarized affidavit. But this document did not bear the expired commission seal I had discovered earlier. This affidavit was stamped by a second, entirely different notary public. I quickly scanned the commission number and instantly recognized it as a valid, currently active credential. The text of the affidavit was devastating. This active, legally commissioned notary swore under penalty of perjury that Luna Thompson had physically appeared before her at the residence on Elm Street and had willingly signed the quitclaim deed transferring ownership to Gary Thompson. My breathing grew shallow. My entire legal strategy had rested on two foundational pillars. The first was that the original notary seal was provably expired. The second was that I was physically traveling overseas on the date in question. Gary had seemingly neutralized both arguments in a single maneuver. By securing a newly sworn statement from a corrupt or deceived active notary claiming the transaction occurred on a different date, he had effectively muddied the waters. A judge looking at this new affidavit would no longer see a clear-cut case of forgery. They would see a complex factual dispute requiring a lengthy trial. But the affidavit was not the final piece of evidence in the envelope. Tucked beneath the sworn statement was an 8x10 glossy color photograph. I pulled it out and stared at an image that seemed designed to completely dismantle my reality. The photograph depicted a woman sitting at my grandmother's familiar oak kitchen table. She had dark hair similar to mine, cut to a similar length. She was captured mid-signature, a pen pressed to a document that looked exactly like the quitclaim deed. Her face was turned partially away from the camera, obscured by her hair and the angle of the shot, but the physical resemblance was undeniably striking. For one horrible suspended minute sitting in that bright, noisy diner, I honestly believed I might actually lose my grandmother's legacy to a lie bearing my own name. The sheer weight of the manufactured evidence was crushing. Gary had not merely forged a signature. He had orchestrated a theatrical production involving a stand-in actor, a complicit notary, and staged photographic proof. The familiar urge to surrender the old silence that had defined my relationship with my father rose up inside me, powerful and suffocating. The voice in my head whispered the easiest path forward. Just sign the settlement papers. Keep the peace. Give him the house and make this relentless anxiety stop. Gary watched my reaction closely. He saw the color drain from my face and the hesitation in my posture. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his smug smile widening into a grin of total triumph. "You should have just stayed on the road, Luna," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I told you I had this handled. You never could leave well enough alone." I looked down at the photograph again, gripping the edges of the glossy paper so tightly my knuckles turned white. The image was meant to intimidate me, but as I stared at the staged scene, the trained eye of the estate appraiser finally engaged. My profession demands an obsessive attention to minute historical details.
I evaluate the authenticity of an estate not just by examining the primary subject, but by analyzing the surrounding context, the background items, the shadows, the dust. It was the one specific skill set my father and his cheap lawyer had completely failed to account for when they constructed their elaborate deception. My eyes moved away from the woman holding the pen and scanned the periphery of the kitchen table depicted in the photograph. Sitting near the edge of the oak surface, slightly out of focus, but undeniably present, was my grandmother's vintage Haviland teapot. The delicate porcelain piece featured a very specific hand-painted floral motif. I stared at the spout and then at the lid. There, barely visible but absolutely present, was the distinct hairline chip near the rim. The breath caught in my throat, and a surge of pure crystalline adrenaline flushed the panic entirely out of my system. I knew exactly where that specific teapot was located. It was not sitting on the kitchen table in Mobile, Alabama. I had personally packed that fragile piece of porcelain, wrapping it meticulously in archival tissue paper before I left on my business trip. I had driven it to a secure climate-controlled storage unit located 300 miles away in Charlotte, North Carolina, specifically to have it cleaned and appraised by a ceramics specialist. I had the dated entry logs from the storage facility. More importantly, I had the teapot thoroughly photographed, documented, and time-stamped in my leather appraisal ledger, showing it safely locked in Charlotte during the entire month this witness photo was supposedly taken. The image in front of me was not historical proof that I had signed a deed. It was undeniable forensic proof that Gary and Brenda had staged this photograph recently within the last few weeks, using props they found lying around the house long after I had departed for my trip. They had used the teapot to make the scene look authentic, completely unaware that I could definitively establish its geographic location, rendering their timeline physically impossible. The floor that I thought had dropped out from beneath me was actually the ground giving way beneath their entire conspiracy. By attempting to strengthen his forgery with fabricated photographic evidence, Gary had inadvertently handed me the definitive proof required to destroy him. He had tied his fake notary and his fake witness to an object that proved they were all lying. I slowly slid the photograph back into the manila envelope, placing it gently on top of the perjured affidavit. I looked up, meeting my father's triumphant gaze with an expression of absolute Arctic calm. I did not raise my voice or express a single ounce of the relief flooding my veins. I closed the flap of the folder and pushed it back across the sticky Formica table toward the lawyer. "Thank you," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "You just committed a second felony in writing and provided the photographic evidence to prove it." I slid out of the vinyl booth, leaving my father and his attorney staring at the envelope in sudden confusion. The valley of despair was over. I had found the handhold I needed, and the climb toward complete retribution had officially begun. The beauty of a gold digger lies in her finely tuned survival instincts. Brenda did not possess a law degree. She did not comprehend the intricate nuances of interstate storage timestamps or digital metadata. But she had spent her life hopping from one provider to the next, surviving by reading the subtle shifts in a room. When I leaned across the sticky Formica table and dismantled their fabricated photograph, she understood the exact instant power transferred into my hands. She watched her hired attorney turn the color of chalk. She saw the smug confidence drain out of the man she thought was her wealthy meal ticket. I had explained in a calm, steady voice that staging a photograph to support a forged affidavit constituted a criminal conspiracy. I made sure to look directly into Brenda's eyes when I mentioned that fabricating evidence meant the legal liability now included her. The trademark smirk she had worn since the moment I found my clothes on the porch evaporated. In its place, a cold, calculating focus emerged. She stopped leaning against Gary. She physically shifted her weight away from him, creating a small but undeniable distance in the vinyl booth. I let her sit with that rising panic because a frightened, cornered accomplice is infinitely more useful than a signed confession. I slid out of the booth and walked to my car, leaving my father and his attorney to panic over their ruined strategy. I drove back to my hotel room and immediately opened my laptop. I did not feel the need to pace the floor or worry about their next move. The board was already set. I pulled up the secure dashboard for the cloud cameras I had installed during the locksmith visit.
The high-definition feeds loaded on my screen, showing the quiet exterior and the dimly lit interior of my grandmother's home. The hidden parlor lens disguised inside the wooden bookend provided a perfect, unobstructed vantage point of the antique cabinet. Now I only had to wait for human nature to take its predictable course. By noon the following day, the camera feeds validated my theory. Gary walked out the front door and drove away in his truck. He was likely heading to the strip mall law office to manage the disaster of the fabricated photograph or to beg for a new defense strategy. The moment his taillights disappeared from the street, Brenda mobilized. She did not waste time mourning the end of her relationship or considering the moral implications of her actions. Through the video feed, I watched her drag 3 large canvas duffel bags down the main staircase. Tyler trailed closely behind her, carrying his gaming consoles and untidy bundles of clothing. She was orchestrating a rapid exit before the legal consequences of Gary and his forged quitclaim deed could ensnare her in a federal indictment. Packing her own wardrobe was legal. Taking her son's electronics was legal. I watched the screen with clinical detachment as they piled their personal belongings near the front door. But then, Brenda changed her trajectory. She walked away from the entryway and headed directly into the formal parlor. This was a room she had previously avoided because it offered no modern comforts or entertainment. Now she marched straight toward the locked glass front cabinet tucked in the corner. She pulled a heavy flathead screwdriver from her pocket and wedged it into the brass latch. She pried the door open, splintering the historic wood with a harsh, careless snap. I leaned closer to my laptop screen, watching her reach past the decorative porcelain figures. She laid her hands on the prize she had likely been eyeing since the day she moved in. The 1880s sterling silver service. It was a breathtaking collection of heavy, ornate pieces, including a large serving tray, an intricately engraved coffee urn, and twin sugar bowls. My grandmother Ruth and I had spent an entire rainy January cataloging that specific collection. We polished every inch, photographing the distinct maker's marks and noting the precise troy-ounce weight of each piece in my leather appraisal ledger. Ruth wanted to ensure that if the collection ever needed to be liquidated, her heirs would know its exact insured value. She never imagined her meticulous record-keeping would serve as a snare for a thief. Brenda lifted the heavy sterling serving tray and turned it slowly toward the window light. I could see the gears turning in her head. She was calculating the raw melt weight, pricing the silver by the ounce in her mind. She believed she was being incredibly clever. She assumed that since Gary's bank accounts were about to be frozen by a fraud investigation, untraceable physical assets were her only viable severance package. She thought she was salvaging unrecorded wealth from a sinking ship before the captain dragged her down into the depths of a criminal trial. She had no idea she was holding an item with a registered insurance rider. She was unaware of the hidden camera capturing her face, her actions, and the specific items she was shoving into her canvas duffel bag. She was walking on live video into a trap I had not even needed to build. My grandmother and I had built it years earlier, one careful photograph and one ledger entry at a time. Tyler stood in the doorway, serving as a nervous lookout, while Brenda wrapped the silver pieces in old bath towels to muffle the clinking sounds. They stuffed the entire priceless service into the bag, zipping it shut with hurried, frantic motions. My thumb hovered over my phone. I could have dialed emergency services right then and reported a burglary in progress. It would have been a swift end to the situation, but a premature phone call would have ruined the final phase of my strategy. If the local police arrived while Brenda was still inside the house, the situation would devolve into another frustrating civil dispute. Brenda would simply lie to the responding officers. She would claim she was taking the silver to polish it, or that Gary had explicitly gifted the items to her as a token of his affection. Gary, desperate to keep her on his side and maintain his illusion, might even corroborate her lie, thereby shielding her from theft charges and leaving me to fight them both in property court for months. I needed her to commit to the theft entirely. In legal terms, I needed asportation. I needed her to carry the stolen goods across the threshold, place them into a moving vehicle, and attempt to leave the premises. I did not want a messy domestic squabble in a parlor where plausible deniability still existed. I wanted daylight. I wanted the nosy neighbors watching from their manicured lawns.
I wanted an off-duty county deputy standing right beside me to witness the exact moment she tried to abscond with a fortune that did not belong to her. Gary had attempted to steal my inheritance using forged paper and fabricated affidavits, hoping the bureaucracy would shield him. Brenda, lacking his patience for white-collar fraud, was attempting to steal it by the pound. I decided to let her finish packing her duffel bag. I watched the live feed as she hauled the heavy stolen silver out to the hallway, preparing for her final departure. I closed my laptop and unplugged the power cord. I picked up my leather ledger, feeling the solid weight of the truth in my hands. The final act of this ordeal was set, and it was time for me to go meet the moving truck. The 30th day of the eviction notice arrived thick and heavy with the oppressive, suffocating humidity that defines an Alabama summer morning. The air felt like a warm, damp blanket pressing against my skin as I drove toward Elm Street. However, the formal ticking clock of the 30-day notice was not the primary catalyst forcing my father and his makeshift family out of the historic craftsman home. The eviction notice was merely the administrative vehicle. The true driving force behind their rapid, disorganized departure was the staggering weight of the documented fraud resting squarely on their shoulders. Faced with the undeniable reality of two separate felony charges, forging a recorded instrument and fabricating evidence to support a fraudulent bank loan, the cheap strip mall lawyer had wisely chosen to withdraw his representation. Gary, realizing that his elaborate deception had completely unraveled and terrified at the prospect of an immediate referral to the United States Attorney, had capitulated completely. He had signed my lawyer Davis's stringent civil agreement, sacrificing his pride and his stolen equity rather than face a guaranteed federal indictment and a lengthy prison sentence. I arrived at my property precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. I did not come alone to supervise this final surrender. I had hired 2 burly professional movers wearing matching gray uniforms to handle any heavy lifting and ensure the premises were vacated swiftly. More importantly, I had retained the services of an off-duty Mobile County Sheriff's deputy to conduct an official civil standby. The deputy, a tall, imposing man with a calm, professional demeanor and a holstered sidearm, stood silently by my side. His presence was not a theatrical prop, it was a necessary tactical precaution to prevent the situation from devolving into another chaotic shouting match on the front lawn. When we pulled up to the curb, the scene unfolding before us confirmed every suspicion my hidden parlor camera had raised. A rented 20-foot U-Haul truck was parked awkwardly on the lush green grass of my front yard, deeply rutting the soil. The engine was idling, sending a low, steady vibration through the humid air. Brenda and Tyler were in a state of frantic, panicked motion. They were rushing back and forth between the front door and the truck loading cardboard boxes and hastily packed garbage bags with reckless speed. The master bedroom window on the second floor remained dark and silent, indicating that Gary was still inside, presumably sleeping off the humiliation of signing away his fraudulent victory the night before. Brenda was clearly orchestrating a covert exit, aiming to abandon the sinking ship and abscond with whatever she could carry before the man who had brought her into this mess even woke up to realize she was gone. I watched from the sidewalk as Tyler struggled to maneuver 2 heavy, ornately carved wooden chairs down the steep metal ramp of the moving truck. My breath caught in my throat for a fraction of a second. Those were not cheap particle board pieces purchased from a big box store. They were my grandmother Ruth's priceless antique pecan wood dining chairs, part of a matched set that had been in the family for generations. He was dragging them carelessly, the delicate carved feet scraping roughly against the abrasive metal grating. As Tyler wrestled the antique chairs into the back of the truck, Brenda hurried out the front door. She was not carrying clothes or toiletries. She was clutching a large, bulging canvas duffel bag tightly against her chest, holding it with both arms, as if her life depended on it. As she practically jogged toward the U-Haul, the heavy bag shifted, and a distinct muffled metallic clink echoed across the quiet morning lawn. It was the unmistakable resonant sound of heavy stacked sterling silver colliding against itself inside the canvas. The 1880s antique service set I had watched her pry from the parlor cabinet on the hidden camera feed
was currently secured in her arms. She was roughly 30 feet away from loading a fortune in stolen family heirlooms into a rented vehicle and disappearing onto the interstate. I did not break into a run or shout across the yard. I walked forward at a measured, deliberate pace, the county deputy matching my stride step for step. We positioned ourselves directly at the base of the metal U-Haul ramp, blocking the only path to the open cargo door. Tyler froze, still holding one of the pecan wood chairs, looking nervously from me to the uniformed officer. Brenda stopped abruptly, her momentum completely arrested by our sudden appearance. She clutched the heavy duffel bag even tighter to her chest, her knuckles turning white from the strain. The color rapidly drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and suddenly very old in the harsh morning light. "Good morning, Brenda," I said, my voice projecting a cool, professional authority that completely ignored the panic radiating from her posture. Moving day is always such a stressful, chaotic experience. Let us take a moment to ensure that absolutely nothing belonging to the estate has accidentally left the premises with your personal belongings. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and immediate fierce defiance. She knew she was caught, but the gold digger survival instinct demanded that she attempt to bluff her way through the confrontation. "Move out of my way," she demanded, her voice trembling slightly, but attempting to project harsh authority. "I am simply taking what is mine and leaving. You have your precious house back, so step aside and let us go." I did not move a single inch. I slowly opened my thick leather appraisal ledger, flipping directly to the brightly tabbed section dedicated to the estate's silver collection. "You do not own a single item in that canvas bag," Brenda, I stated, clearly articulating each word so there could be no misunderstanding. "And unlike you, I do not have to rely on a forged affidavit or a fabricated story to make my claim. I can prove the ownership and provenance of every single piece inside that duffel with a high-resolution photograph, a documented serial notch, and a certified insurance appraisal rider." I turned slightly, addressing the silent county deputy standing tall beside me. "Officer," I said, maintaining eye contact with Brenda, "that specific canvas duffel bag currently contains roughly $10,000 in cataloged antique sterling silver stolen directly from a locked cabinet inside my home. Furthermore, I strongly suspect it also contains a vintage Haviland teapot, an item I can definitively prove was located in a secure climate-controlled storage unit in Charlotte, North Carolina last month, rendering any claim that it was recently gifted or legitimately acquired physically impossible." The deputy stepped forward, his hand resting casually but firmly near his duty belt. His demeanor shifted from a passive observer to an active law enforcement official managing a potential felony theft. The air on the lawn seemed to grow even heavier. Brenda's hands began to visibly shake on the zipper of the bag, the metallic clinking sound betraying her severe internal tremor. She looked wildly toward the front door, perhaps hoping Gary would suddenly emerge and magically talk his way out of this disaster, but the house remained entirely silent. She was completely isolated, facing the immediate consequences of her greed. This was the exact moment that years of my grandmother Ruth's careful, meticulous cataloging finally culminated into an impenetrable fortress. The countless rainy afternoons we had spent photographing hallmarks, weighing silver trays, and organizing files, an activity that everyone else in the house had dismissively labeled as the boring, fussy hobby of an eccentric old spinster, suddenly became a towering, unscalable wall that no forged quitclaim deed or fabricated witness affidavit could ever overcome. Standing there on the damp grass blocking the ramp, I felt no surge of arrogant triumph or vindictive glee. I felt something much profounder and far more grounding. I felt Ruth's presence standing right beside me on that porch, her legacy finally secured and protected exactly as I had promised her. The digital camera footage from the parlor was already safely backed up to the cloud, ensuring that even if Brenda attempted to run, I had the definitive proof of the burglary. The deputy looked at the shaking woman clutching the stolen silver and delivered the instruction that officially ended her escape. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of the law, "I am going to need you to open that bag right now." The deputy placed his hand firmly on his duty belt and stepped closer to the trembling woman. "Ma'am," he
repeated his voice, dropping to a register that left no room for negotiation. "I am going to need you to open that bag right now." The morning humidity felt thick enough to slice, but a sudden chill seemed to radiate from the canvas duffel. Brenda looked around wildly, searching the manicured lawns and empty driveways for an escape route that did not exist. Finding none, she slowly lowered the heavy bag onto the damp grass. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she reached for the brass zipper. The metal teeth parted with a harsh grating sound that echoed loudly across the quiet suburban street. She pulled back the dark canvas fabric and peeled away a layer of cheap hotel bath towels she had used for padding. The morning sunlight immediately caught the polished surface of my grandmother's 1880s sterling silver service. The ornate engravings and the distinct heavy curves of the antique teapot gleamed undeniably in the Alabama sun. There was no plausible deniability left. She had been caught red-handed, attempting to steal a documented fortune. The commotion on the front lawn had not gone unnoticed. In a historic neighborhood where houses sit close together and front porches serve as observation decks, secrets rarely stay hidden. Doors began to open. Neighbors stepped out onto their verandas holding coffee mugs, pretending to check their mailboxes while keeping their eyes fixed firmly on my driveway. But the most significant arrival happened a moment later. A large silver sedan rolled slowly down Elm Street and eased to a stop right at my curb. I recognized the vehicle immediately. It belonged to Marianne, a prominent member of the local Baptist church and one of my father's most vocal supporters. She was driving 3 other women from the congregation, the exact same women who had spent the past month actively participating in Gary's smear campaign. They had gossiped at luncheons and prayer meetings, painting me as a heartless monster who had ruthlessly thrown her grieving father onto the street. Now they sat captive in their idling car, rolling down their windows to witness the undeniable unraveling of that exact narrative. I did not shrink from their stares. I welcomed the audience. I opened my thick leather appraisal ledger and flipped to the detailed inventory section I had built with my grandmother. I looked at the deputy and then at the stolen silver resting on the grass. I began to read, my voice carrying clear and steady across the lawn, ensuring the women in the idling sedan could hear every single syllable. Item 42, I stated, reading the precise description from the page. A sterling silver teapot featuring a distinct floral motif and a minor hairline chip to the inner lid. Provenance traces back to Ruth Thompson, circa 1884. I pointed a finger at the gleaming teapot resting inside the canvas duffel. The deputy leaned down and visually confirmed the specific chip on the lid. Then I turned my attention to Tyler, who was still awkwardly holding one of the wooden dining chairs near the ramp of the moving truck. Item 43. I continued turning the page of my ledger. A set of 6 antique pecan wood dining chairs featuring hand-carved ball and claw feet. For the next 45 agonizing minutes, the front lawn transformed into a public staging ground for restitution. The deputy directed Brenda and Tyler to carefully unload every single stolen item from the truck and the duffel bags, placing them piece by piece onto the green grass. The physical toll of the rising heat was visible on their faces, but the psychological humiliation was far more punishing. Brenda had to kneel on the damp ground extracting silver sugar bowls, antique serving platters, and delicate crystal vases from her luggage. Tyler was forced to march back and forth carrying the heavy pecan wood chairs and several vintage Tiffany lamps he had tried to bury beneath a pile of moving blankets. As they retrieved each item, I methodically checked it against the high-resolution photographs and the insured values listed in my ledger. I did not rush the process. I took my time verifying the maker's marks and the serial notches, making sure the neighborhood and the church ladies saw exactly how much wealth this woman had attempted to smuggle out of my home. The myth of the sweet, supportive new girlfriend was systematically dismantled on the lawn, replaced by the undeniable reality of a calculated theft. When the final stolen antique was safely resting on the grass, I decided to let the retribution land exactly where it belonged. I closed my leather ledger and walked slowly toward the silver sedan parked at the curb. The women inside watched me approach, their expressions shifting from eager curiosity to profound discomfort. They expected me to yell or perhaps gloat over my victory. Instead, I addressed them with the quiet, grounded calm I had learned directly from my grandmother. I reached into my linen blazer and pulled out 2 crisp pieces of paper. I held them up to the open car window. The first was a certified copy of the forged quitclaim deed bearing my father's name and the fraudulent notary stamp. The second was the authentic 2019 warranty deed legally transferring the property from Ruth directly to me. "This is the greedy jet-setting daughter you were told about," I said, my tone devoid of anger but heavy with the undeniable weight of evidence. "And this paperwork is the reason why that story was invented." I did not return home to evict a grieving father out of spite. I returned home to discover that my father had forged a legal document, stolen $50,000 from a local credit union, and attempted to steal my inheritance to fund his new lifestyle. The women in the car stared at the documents, their mouths slightly open, unable to formulate a response. They realized in that searing moment that they had been used as pawns in a felony fraud scheme. Their righteous indignation evaporated, leaving only the bitter taste of misplaced loyalty. Just as the church ladies absorbed the truth, the heavy oak front door of the craftsman house creaked open. Gary stumbled out onto the porch. He was wearing his plaid pajamas, his hair disheveled, and his eyes squinting against the bright morning sun. The commotion had finally woken him from his sleep. He rubbed his face and looked out over the lawn, struggling to comprehend the bizarre tableau unfolding before him. He saw the rented moving truck, the uniformed county deputy, and the sprawling collection of antique silver and furniture scattered across the grass. Then he saw Brenda. She was standing near the back of the truck, her face pale and her posture rigid with defeat. "Brenda, what are you doing?" Gary pleaded, his voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and sudden rising panic. He gripped the porch railing, leaning forward, as if trying to physically pull the scene back into a reality he could control. He expected her to run to his side to explain the misunderstanding and offer him comfort. But Brenda did not even look at him. She recognized that the illusion was permanently broken. Gary was no longer a wealthy patriarch with a historic estate. He was a financially ruined man facing severe criminal consequences who had just lost the very collateral she had hoped to acquire. Her survival instincts kicked in, overriding any lingering pretense of affection. She ignored his plea completely. She shoved past the deputy, walked briskly up the metal ramp, and climbed into the passenger side of the moving truck. Tyler quickly followed, shutting the heavy rear cargo door with a resounding metallic clang. He jogged to the driver's side, started the engine, and slammed the transmission into gear. The large truck lurched forward, pulling away from the curb and accelerating down Elm Street without a single backward glance. Brenda abandoned the man she had helped ruin, cutting her losses the instant the financial benefits evaporated. Gary stood entirely alone on the front porch, watching the truck disappear around the corner. The silence that followed was suffocating. I walked back up the brick path and stood near the bottom of the steps, looking up at the man who had raised me. I noticed something sitting on the porch boards just to his left. 3 large black plastic garbage bags sat slumped against the railing. They were filled with his clothing, packed exactly the way he and Brenda had packed my belongings 30 days prior. I had not ordered the movers to pack his things that way. Brenda had done it herself while preparing for her hasty exit. Gary had built this entire situation with his own 2 hands, orchestrating the forgery, the lies, and the cruel eviction. Now he had to stand inside the wreckage of his own creation, publicly exposed, while the entire neighborhood watched the truth spill out onto the lawn, one stolen teapot at a time. The poetic symmetry of those black trash bags was a flawless, quiet execution of consequence. I did not need to raise my voice to secure my victory. The consequences had delivered themselves. The heavy, humid air of the Alabama morning seemed to thicken around us as the sound of the rented moving truck faded into the distance. Gary remained entirely paralyzed on the front porch of the historic craftsman home, staring blankly at the empty space on the street where Brenda had parked just moments before. The reality of his complete isolation was settling over him like a physical weight. The woman he had financed with stolen money had abandoned him. The neighbors who had previously hung on his every word now viewed him with undisguised pity and contempt.
And his daughter, the one he had assumed would quietly absorb his betrayal, was standing at the bottom of the steps, holding the legal documents that would determine the rest of his life. The church ladies in the silver sedan had silently rolled up their windows and driven away, carrying the undeniable truth of his crimes back to the congregation. His carefully constructed illusion was reduced to a pile of antique silver on the lawn and 3 black trash bags resting against the porch railing. I reached into the leather satchel slung across my shoulder and felt the distinct edges of 2 separate manila envelopes. I had brought both options with me to the property exactly as I had requested my attorney Davis prepare them weeks earlier. In the left pocket was the stringent civil settlement agreement. This document outlined a grueling financial repayment plan designed to strip Gary of his remaining assets to satisfy the fraudulent bank loan. In the right pocket rested the formal criminal referral drafted and ready to be delivered directly to the United States Attorney. That envelope contained the forged quitclaim deed, the expired notary commission, the fabricated witness affidavit, and the photographic evidence of the misplaced Haviland teapot. It was a comprehensive, meticulously documented package that would trigger an immediate federal indictment for wire fraud and forgery. I needed only to make one brief phone call to Davis to initiate the criminal prosecution. This was the moral fork in the road we had discussed in the freezing wood-paneled office downtown. It had finally arrived, transitioning from a theoretical legal strategy to an immediate, irreversible reality. I stood on the brick walkway, and I want to be entirely honest about the profound conflict warring inside me. My thumb hovered nervously over the screen of my smartphone. Every single instinct that had been wounded, humiliated, and called a liar on my own front lawn desperately wanted to make that phone call. The anger burned hot and bright in my chest, demanding retribution. He absolutely deserved the harshest penalty the justice system could deliver. He had not simply made a poor financial decision, he had executed a premeditated scheme to steal my grandmother's legacy. He had forged my signature, manufactured a fake witness, placed a hostile teenager in my childhood bed, and actively attempted to ruin my reputation in my hometown. Sending him to a federal penitentiary felt like the only appropriate response to the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. No judge or jury in the country would ever blame me for choosing to prosecute. As I looked at my father standing broken and confused in his pajamas, a vivid memory surfaced unexpectedly, cutting through the intense anger. I remembered a rainy Sunday afternoon years ago, driving along the Mobile Bay Causeway in his old pickup truck. I was a terrified teenager gripping the steering wheel while the tires slipped on the wet pavement. Gary had placed a steady, reassuring hand on my shoulder, guiding me through the skid with patient, calm instructions. That was the man I had loved and respected, the man who had eventually succumbed to his own vanity and greed. Then the clear, authoritative voice of my grandmother Ruth echoed in my mind. I remembered her final instruction delivered from her bed, smelling of lavender and rubbing alcohol. "Do not ever let that man make you feel small in your own house," she had commanded. I analyzed her words with the precise logic of an estate appraiser evaluating a provenance letter. She had explicitly instructed me to protect my boundaries and maintain my dignity. She had not instructed me to destroy him. She had warned me against allowing his chaotic financial choices to dictate my self-worth. Sending my own flesh and blood to a concrete cell for 5 years would not honor her legacy or keep her promise. It would only serve as permanent, undeniable proof that I had become exactly the kind of person he was. I would be confirming that I was someone who ruthlessly discards family members the very instant it becomes legally convenient or emotionally satisfying to do so. That cold, calculated detachment was the defining characteristic of his betrayal. If I wielded the criminal referral as a weapon of vengeance, I would be adopting his lack of humanity. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of damp grass and old brick. I slowly lowered my phone, sliding it back into my pocket. The desire for vengeance faded, replaced by a profound, settling calm. The kind of clarity that arrives when you finally recognize the difference between causing pain and demanding accountability. I reached into my satchel and withdrew the envelope containing the civil agreement. I walked up the steps, bypassing the black trash bags, and handed the thick stack of papers to my father. He looked down at the document, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused.
The forged quitclaim deed is being formally voided by the court. I stated, my voice stripping away any residual emotion or familial warmth. It was the voice of a landlord executing a contract. The local credit union has realized the collateral was fraudulent, and they are calling the $50,000 loan due immediately. You are going to sign this agreement, Gary. The terms are non-negotiable. You will sell your pickup truck by the end of the week. You will drain whatever remains of your personal retirement accounts. You will secure a job, and you will repay every single dollar of the stolen equity to that bank. Gary stared at the legal clauses, his hands trembling visibly as he grasped the pages. He realized the sheer magnitude of the financial ruin he had brought upon himself. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an excuse or plead for a softer timeline, but I cut him off before he could articulate a single syllable. I stepped closer, ensuring he understood the gravity of the alternative. If you miss one single payment, I continued, my tone dropping to a hard whisper. If you attempt to delay this process or manipulate the bank. The second envelope resting in my bag goes directly to the district attorney that same afternoon. That envelope contains your name, the fabricated witness photograph, and the word felony. I am giving you a choice today, but I am keeping the weapon loaded. He did not argue. The arrogant bluster that had defined his behavior for the past 30 days was completely extinguished. He understood that the decoy daughter, the woman he thought would quietly sleep on a sunporch, was gone forever. In her place stood an estate appraiser holding his freedom hostage to a payment schedule. He nodded slowly, accepting the crushing reality of his new existence. We walked down the brick path toward my car parked at the curb. He placed the civil agreement flat on the warm metal hood of the vehicle. I handed him a pen. He signed his name on the designated lines, his signature shaking, reflecting the absolute destruction of his pride. By the end of that week, Gary had relocated into a tiny rundown studio apartment situated near the noisy interstate highway, far away from the historic district and the sprawling lawns of Elm Street. He sold his truck and began the grueling, humiliating process of working off a massive debt in his late 60s. I did not send my father to a federal prison, but I ensured he would spend the next decade functioning under the crushing weight of his own terrible choices. I chose mercy, not because he had earned it or deserved a second chance. I chose it because I absolutely refused to let his betrayal turn me into a cruel and vindictive person. I maintained my humanity while simultaneously securing my borders. That was the specific kind of justice that truly mattered to me. It was the kind of justice that leaves your conscience clean and your spirit intact long after the conflict ends. That evening, I sat alone on my own front porch. It was my grandmother's porch again in every sense that mattered. The oppressive Alabama heat had finally broken, yielding to a soft coastal breeze rolling in off the dark waters of the Gulf of Mexico. A tall glass of sweet tea sat sweating on the vintage wicker side table next to my chair. The condensation gathered and dripped slowly onto the painted wood, matching the slow, steady rhythm of my breathing. The thick air carried the intoxicating scent of blooming night jasmine, masking any lingering traces of the chaotic month I had just survived. For the first time in over 30 days, the historic craftsman house behind me was entirely silent. There were no booming televisions, no raised, entitled voices, and no strangers treating my family legacy like a cheap motel. The profound quiet felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders, allowing me to finally sit up straight. I took a slow sip of the cold tea and let the reality of the day settle deep into my bones. The battle was over, and the territory was secure. The legal machinery I had set into motion had completed its work with ruthless efficiency. Davis had pushed the civil paperwork through the county court system, finalizing the destruction of my father's elaborate lie. The forged quitclaim deed had been officially and permanently voided by a judge's signature. When I pulled up the Mobile County property portal, now the digital record displayed one single unblemished line of ownership. The title read, "One name and one name only. Mine. Clean, clear, and undisputed." The local credit union had formally removed the $50,000 lien from my property, transferring the debt entirely to Gary as an unsecured personal loan.
He was now legally bound to a strict repayment schedule backed by the looming threat of the criminal referral I kept locked in my safe deposit box. The financial burden he tried to place on my shoulders had been wrapped tightly around his own neck.
Inside the house, the physical restoration had already begun. Earlier that afternoon, I had spent 2 hours in the formal parlor reclaiming the space. The 1880s sterling silver service that Brenda had so desperately tried to smuggle out in a canvas bag was meticulously polished and returned to its rightful place behind the glass doors of the corner cabinet. I wiped away her frantic fingerprints from the delicate metal. I took my time checking every single piece against the photographs and insurance riders in my leather appraisal ledger. The heavy serving tray, the engraved coffee urn, the twin sugar bowls, and the antique teapot with the hairline chip were all accounted for. The inventory system my grandmother and I had built together on rainy Sunday afternoons had worked flawlessly. It had transformed a collection of family memories into an impenetrable legal shield. I locked the cabinet door and pocketed the brass key, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. But the most important act of reclamation happened upstairs on the second floor. I walked down the hallway and stepped into the primary bedroom, the sacred space Gary had so casually handed over to his girlfriend's teenage son. In their frantic, chaotic exit that morning, Tyler and Brenda had left behind a disrespectful mess of tangled charging cords, discarded snack wrappers, and lingering stale odors. I systematically removed every remaining trace of their unauthorized occupancy. I gathered up the abandoned gaming wires, the empty soda bottles, and the cheap plastic hangers they had left scattered in the closet. I bagged them up and carried them directly out to the municipal trash bins on the curb. Then I returned to the room and stripped the mattress bare, pulling off the unfamiliar sheets a stranger had slept on. I opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed and lifted out my grandmother's vintage hand-stitched quilt. I unfolded the heavy heirloom fabric, shaking out the rich scent of cedar, and laid it gently across the mattress. I smoothed out the intricate patterned squares with my hands, aligning the edges perfectly. I placed the quilt exactly where it belonged, restoring the dignity and history of the room. And there was a profound, fitting irony to this restoration. The deep cleaning of the carpets, the changing of the locks, and the professional detailing the house required were being paid for directly by the first installment of Gary's court-mandated restitution. His own monthly repayments were funding the erasure of his mistake. The room he stole was the room I restored using his money. Sitting on the porch, watching the fireflies flicker over the dark, expansive lawn, I realized how fundamentally my understanding of strength had shifted. I used to think that holding your ground meant engaging in bitter shouting matches. I thought standing up for yourself required screaming until your throat was hoarse, and that revenge had to be a loud, destructive spectacle. I had spent my entire adult life avoiding conflict because I abhorred the noise and the messy, emotional fallout. The old version of me deeply believed that maintaining my silence was the only way to keep my family whole. I thought absorbing their disrespect was a noble, necessary sacrifice to maintain a facade of Southern harmony. But sitting in the quiet, jasmine-scented air, I recognized the fatal flaw in that strategy. My silence had never purchased genuine peace. It had only taught the people around me that I would absorb anything they chose to inflict. It signaled to my father that my boundaries were entirely negotiable if he just pushed hard enough or utilized enough guilt. The answer to surviving a toxic family dynamic was never to become as loud, manipulative, or cruel as the person who wronged me. The true solution was much quieter and infinitely harder to execute. It was to stop making myself small to accommodate their delusions. It was to speak precisely using verifiable paper, relying on irrefutable proof instead of raw, volatile emotion. It was about gathering the ledgers, the unassailable timelines, and the certified deeds, and letting the facts do the heavy lifting for me. More importantly, it was about choosing exactly who I wanted to be when I finally held all the power. When the moment came to deploy the ultimate weapon, I did not choose annihilation. I did not set out to destroy my father or send him to a federal prison cell just to satisfy a fleeting desire for vengeance.
I set out to keep a sacred promise to the brilliant woman who saw all of this coming, and I navigated the conflict determined not to lose my own humanity in the process. I held him accountable, ensuring he faced severe consequences without becoming a monster myself. That is the only kind of justice that leaves your conscience clean. Peace is not a gift that is simply handed to you by a dysfunctional family. It is not a natural state of grace that you earn by being endlessly compliant and agreeable. Sometimes peace is a hard-won territory that you have to actively reclaim with a registered deed, a thick leather ledger, and the steadfast refusal to make a single sound louder than the absolute truth. You do not have to match their chaotic energy. You only have to outlast their lies with your documentation. If someone in your life is counting on your silence to fund their comfort and subsidize their terrible choices, do not scream at them. Do not give them the theatrical reaction they crave to justify their behavior. Just show them exactly what your voice looks like once it is legally notarized. Thank you for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment below if you have ever had to draw a hard line and reclaim your own space from the people who thought you were too weak to fight back. Remember to subscribe to Ariana Revenger for more stories of justice served cold. The loud ones might start the fire, but the quiet ones always keep the receipts. It has been 6 months since the rented moving truck pulled away from my curb, taking the noise, the entitlement, and the deceit with it. The historic Craftsman house on Elm Street is finally mine, not just on a watermarked deed filed in a county courthouse, but in the physical way I occupy the space. I no longer walk softly on my own floorboards. The black trash bags that once sat baking on my porch are a distant memory, replaced by potted ferns and the quiet certainty of a woman who fully claimed her ground. Looking back at the elaborate wreckage my father left behind, I realize that surviving a family dynamic like mine requires more than just a sharp attorney. It requires a fundamental shift in how you view your own worth. I paid a high emotional price for this sanctuary, but I walked away with 5 distinct lessons that I will carry into every room I enter for the rest of my life. First, I learned that silence is never a substitute for peace. For years, I genuinely believed that biting my tongue and absorbing the slights was an act of mature love. In reality, my silence only subsidized my father's disrespect. When you stay quiet to keep the peace, you are the only one paying the bill. Second, I learned that raw emotion will lose to meticulous documentation every single time. Entitled, manipulative people absolutely thrive in chaos, hearsay, and dramatic shouting matches. What they cannot survive is a verifiable paper trail. A leather ledger, a digital timestamp, and a certified record will always outspeak a temper tantrum. You do not ever have to raise your voice if your receipts are in pristine order. Third, I discovered the true definition of power. Power is not the ability to utterly destroy someone who wronged you, even when they federally and morally deserve it. True power is holding the absolute ability to ruin them and choosing strict boundaries over vindictive cruelty. Forcing Gary to face his financial ruin rather than a federal prison cell kept my conscience perfectly clean and my grandmother's legacy untainted. Fourth, I learned that you must never shrink yourself to fit comfortably inside someone else's delusion. My father wanted me to be the submissive, accommodating daughter sleeping on a sweltering sunporch just so he could play the wealthy patriarch for his new girlfriend. The exact moment I stood up to my full professional and legal height, his entire false reality instantly collapsed. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, I finally learned that shared blood does not entitle anyone to your sanctuary. Family is a title earned through mutual respect and honesty, not a permanent hall pass for exploitation. You have the absolute right to evict toxic people from your life, whether that requires a commercial locksmith, a civil lawsuit, or simply a firmly closed door. Today, the antique silver gleams safely in the parlor cabinet, and the house smells of lemon oil and blooming jasmine exactly as Ruth intended. I kept my promise to her, but more importantly, I finally kept a promise to myself. I stopped being the doormat and became the sole architect of my own life. If you are currently sitting quietly in the background of your own life, holding your tongue while someone else spends your peace, it is time to start auditing your reality. Gather your documents, secure your boundaries,
And remember that you do not need to scream to be heard. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you found strength in this story, please drop a comment below, sharing the hardest boundary you have ever had to draw. Hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to Ariana Revenger for more stories where the quiet ones keep the receipts and the truth always wins.